and I will go to the video introduction of this series. Right. So here we are. So when I come back, I'm not here.
There's a land just off the Atlantic, land of jungles, waterfalls, and sweet scenery, where poor people farm the lands and hunt the waters, and all live in peace and harmony. This is Guyana.
Good evening, and welcome to the GBJ platform for the second in our series, but the first on the GBJ of Nation Building, Guyana Beyond 2030. I'm really pleased to have this evening two amazing co-hosts. Michaela Abraham Ali, who I haven't met before, but over the last few days we've gotten to know each other well. Michaela, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
And Ruel, who I've known for way too long. Ruel, always happy to have you here.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we're never sure which version of Ruel we're getting, but we'll find out later on. But ladies and gentlemen, our guest this evening is no other than Vincent Alexander. I've known Vincent for many years in various guises, and the only guise I actually have never known Vincent in is that guise of presidential candidate, but we'll talk about that later on. Vincent has a storied history, and Vincent will tell us a little bit about his own story. Ladies and gentlemen, nation building is a very simple format. What we do is we look for Guyanese who have substantial stories to tell, substantial histories, and we allow them for 12 to 15 minutes to tell us a little bit about themselves in their words. They frame their histories. And then we bring some of the brightest and the most challenging public discussants. Tonight we have Ruel and Michaela. And we ask them about what's their vision beyond 2030. And the intention of this is for there to be a robust engagement, but respectful, because all of this content will be kept online and become part of a historical document. So before we get into the second part, of course, we start with Vincent walking us through the life of Vincent Alexander. Vincent, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me and considering me worthy of being on this program. I'll start by talking about how come I am here today. I was conceived in Aruba, where my mother resided and worked for 13 years until she decided to return to British Guyana, her place of birth. She returned to have a Guyanese offspring. That decision was occasioned by the fact that the Dutch no longer granted citizenship by means other than lineage and naturalization. Neither my father nor mother were Dutch citizens, nor could I acquire British Guyanese citizenship if birthed in Aruba, since women could not bequeath citizenship. My only options were to be Grenadian by virtue of my father's lineage, or be birthed in my mother's homeland and be granted citizenship by virtue of my place of birth. My mother chose the latter option and returned to British Guyana. I was destined to be Guyanese, and subsequently made a personal decision not to ever migrate. So here's my Guyanese story. Major shapers of my destiny. My being has been shaped by 3 continental sojourns: conceived, birthed, and educationally initiated in the West. Emerged from adolescence in Africa, where I had my first tertiary level education exposure. There I became an avid reader with a focus on development studies in the spheres of politics, political economy, and human resources. I acquired my master's degree in jurisprudence from the People's Friendship University, Moscow. While there, I participated in every sphere of student life, intra and extracurricular. I attended postgraduate seminars and even assisted in the translation of a text on political economy from Russian to English. I was often selected to represent the Latin American and Caribbean students in various fora. I even represented the university overseas. I activated and led the Guyanese Student Society, organized national events, and prepared and distributed news bulletins on Guyana. My prior grounding in Guyana was evident, even as I built on that foundation in preparation for service back home. I'm a global citizen, conceived, born, and bred in different places. The travails of a lower income family. I grew up in an aspirant middle class but lower income home. Consequently, when I sat common entrance and qualified to attend tutorial high school, I could not attend for the want of funding. Eventually, in the subsequent year, after sitting approximately 10 secondary school entrance examinations against my mother's advice, but being promised by my sisters to somehow pay whatever fees, I attained a partial scholarship to attend Chatham High School, where I earned my College of Preceptors certificate and faced my second fees hurdle, since my scholarship expired and I was once again challenged to source funding to continue my secondary education. That hurdle was only overcome when, through the intervention of my elder sister, once again, and the assistance of the Chief Education Officer, I was awarded a place at Christchurch Secondary, one of the few government-aided secondary schools that afforded and offered free tuition. In the meanwhile, I missed one term and had to sit out GC exams for 1 year. However, that experience of hardships endeared me to Burnham and his free education policies, which I subsequently benefited from at the post-secondary and tertiary levels. Upon completion of fifth form, I was ineligible to enter QC because of age. I opted to pursue post-secondary studies in business as an approximate A level, rather than commencing my working career at the bottom of the ladder. Those experiences humbled me and made me an empathetic person. Education, recreation, and personal development. Along the path of educational growth, I became a relatively high achiever and received accolades at every post-secondary institution I attended, including being the best graduating student in my specialization at the master's level. However, I was not the proverbial bookworm. I engaged in many extracurricular activities and experienced tremendous all-around growth that would eventually impact my professional and political development and successes. I became my school's head prefect, a chief server in the church at the tender age of 14, and a youth leader in the church, not to mention some prowess in sports, although it was not more than fun for me. My foundation made me a rounded person. My career path. My career was birthed, unfolded, and developed quite incidentally. What was certain was my intent to be professional in the business or social services sphere. I started out as a qualified accounts clerk. That was overtaken by my secondment to the Ministry of National Development after attending the second developers course. At the ministry, I landed the responsibility of a public educator and mobilizer. That was quite a learning experience at a relatively tender age of 19 plus. After 2 years stint of studies in Tanzania, I assumed a full-time political role as the elected chairman of the Young Socialist Movement, and consequentially a member of the Central Executive Committee of the People's National Congress. As chairman of the Young Socialist Movement, I had the privilege and honor to lead a 170-person delegation drawn from 36 youth organizations, including the YSM and the PYO, to the 10th World Festival of Youth and Students in Cuba. That was but one overseas assignment on behalf of the YSM and the party. After another stint of studies overseas, I did short stints in the public service as a regional executive officer and the PNC before moving on to the University of Guyana as a research fellow for 6 years. During this period, I also served as the assistant dean for the Faculty of Social Sciences. Thereafter, I was appointed deputy registrar and registrar, in which positions I served for 13 to 6 years respectively, all told 25 years at the university, before retiring in 2014 into voluntary public service. During those 25 years, I also pursued studies in public administration, administration of education, political science, and legislative drafting at the graduate and postgraduate levels. My other life. Parallel to my professional career, I was involved in public service as a chair of various boards, board member of various state and non-government organizations, secretary and chair of the Guyana Responsible Parenthood Association, founding member and chair of the National Accreditation Council, Constitutional Reform Commissioner, Local Government Reform Core Chair, parliamentarian, political leader of the People's National Congress, Elections Commissioner, where I still serve, and private consultant. In those engagements, I brought and still bring to bear my skills acquired from my academic studies, training, and experiences. Highlights of those assignments are the establishment of the Forbes Burnham Foundation Awards and Mentorship Scheme, chairman of the International Decade of People of African Descent Assembly, Guyana, in pursuit of the goals of the United Nations declared Decade of the People of African Descent, among others. I also co-edited a CEDA-funded publication on local government in the Caribbean, among other scholarly publications. I served as a columnist, a viewpointer, a commentator, talk show panelist. In addition, I represented the university, the government, and civil society organizations at high-level conferences overseas, including the monitoring of elections in Asia and Latin America, and was awarded with the Golden Arrow of Achievement, among other awards, for my stellar contributions in public service. The factors that made it possible. All of the aforementioned would not have eventuated if my mother did not consciously determine I would be birthed a Guyanese and domiciled here. My matriarchal family also created the nurturing environment even when confronted with obstacles. For 46 years, my wife, Dr. Holly Alexander, has stayed the course and been a pillar of encouragement and support, not to mention the scores of colleagues across the various activities. The policies of Burnham and his regime not only helped to mold my outlook to life, they also offered me, someone from a lower income family, the opportunity to realize my family and personal aspirations, and to be able to make a meaningful contribution to nation building for generations to come. Much that I achieved was through hard and conscientious efforts in a harsh economic environment, but psychosocially enabling environment. For that, I'm eternally grateful.
Thanks a lot, Vincent. And I certainly learned quite a bit about you as a person. I thought I know enough. I didn't realize that you were one of these foreigners who came to our country.
I came conceived.
You came
not conceived.
No, great stuff. Before I ask our other my co-hosts to pile in, I have a question which I want to ask you, Vincent. Why are you not the leader of the PNC?
Well, I'm not the leader of the PNC because I was not elected to be the leader of the PNC. I challenged for that position in 2006. And unfortunately, it's a sour story. I was not elected, therefore I'm not elected.
Tell us a little bit about the Sella story.
Well, it's a question I campaigned on the topic on the manifesto of the introduction of a new political culture. Unfortunately, I don't think the party was quite ready, and a old culture prevailed. I was told that my turn was next. I should wait my turn and not challenge at that time. I wanted to challenge at that time because I felt there was a need for new leadership, the need for new culture. I made that offer, it was not accepted, and here am I today.
Tell me in 30 seconds, what is that new PNC culture that you would have wanted? What would it look like?
It's a culture of politicians being objective, a culture of politicians being patriotic, a culture of politicians not being selfish, a culture of politicians being tolerant, and the embrace in the party and in the country of good governance.
That sounds like a pretty big philosophy, but we can come back to that later. Ruel or Michelle, which of you wants to kick it off? I suspect I know who will. Ruel, you're muted, which is unusual.
Yeah. As I would defer to the veteran journalist.
Oh my goodness. All right. Thank you so much, Roel, for that. Hello, everyone on CBJ and whoever else is watching and listening to our conversation. Thank you very much, Kojo, Dr. Blackman, and of course, our guest, who we get a chance for the next 3/4 of an hour to talk through a number of things as we think about Guyana. We're in 2025, but the objective is looking beyond 2025, 26, 27, 2030, and so forth. So thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, for being our guest and for all that you shared. And so I still wanted to connect a little bit about what I saw just now in the history that you shared. Just 2 points very quickly. I just wanted some clarity on before we delve into the meat of the matter, because I particularly wanted to jump off that new leadership, new culture, good governance and tolerance and objectivity and patriotism. And how do we do that? Because we need that and so much more. But you mentioned you were the best graduating student when you did your master's. I was just curious as to the perhaps a synopsis of your thesis. What was the focus, and perhaps some findings in about a minute?
Well,
The student in me, the student in me is
actually,
curious.
My specialization was in jurisprudence. And what I sought to do is to develop the concept of law in Soviet legal science. So I explored how that concept had evolved from the pre-revolutionary days into the days of the revolution.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sounds interesting. I hope I get to read at some stage. All right. So that would be my the first part on your history. And you said you had to do 10 SE exams? Was it 10 exams? You said?
Entrance examinations.
Entrance exams.
In those
Okay.
days, education was not free except if you got a scholarship to one of the 5 top schools.
Mhm.
I didn't make it to one of the 5 top schools. I couldn't pay to go to tutorial. And so I hung around for a while in primary school. And then through my ambition and aspiration, I sought to sit all of the available entrance examinations and was successful with a partial scholarship to Chatham. And that enabled me, with the assistance of my sister, to attend high school.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So thank you very much. And now let's dive right in, Ruel.
Ruel, you're muted again.
Out of deference, I muted my mic. Well, I should say that I had the pleasure of working with Vincent for about 4 or 5 years when we were both advisors to Dr. Rupert Rupenring under the previous administration. It's an interesting question that Kojo, I think you asked, and an even more interesting answer that was given with regard to Vincent's absence from the leadership of the PNC. Currently, let me be frank, I think we're at we juxtapose against each other politically, But that said, I believe that were he successful previously in the PNC bid, I think the party would have been better off. And again, I'm speaking as somebody who worked with him for 4 or 5 years. My question would be, and this might, I'm sure this will get you in trouble, Vincent, but how significantly would the contours of your leadership differ from what obtains now within the PNC as a whole, but as opposition? I could probably go as far as asking you, if you were in leadership 2015 to 2020, what would the contours of the executive look like? If you're willing to ask them.
The executive of the party you're talking about.
No, the executive of government. There's a PNC government in place, PNC-led government in place 2015 to 2020.
I think one of the problems that we have been faced with in Guyana is not starting off with an acceptance of our reality. I think Guyana is a plural society, and that in itself is just real. There's nothing good or bad about that. Our plurality, however, has been the victim of political polarization and political competition. I think that's a problem we have to confront. And if I were to be in government, it's a problem I'll confront frontally. It has to be confronted, first of all, by an admission of the existence of the problem and the acceptance that we have to build a society that is responsive to the situations, the needs, the circumstances of the various ethnic groups, even as we recognize that there are some things that are common to the ethnic groups. And so those can be dealt with as common things, but there are specific things we need to deal with when it comes to our various ethnic groups. And this is not a pipe dream, because in fact, in Guyana, we have accepted the peculiarity of the Amerindians, preferably the indigenous Guyanese, and are in fact, to some extent, dealing with them in the manner in which we should be able to do an analysis of and deal with the concerns of the other groups. And I think that that's a major thing I would seek to do. In doing that, I would think that one of the essential things is to bring those groups to the table, to governance, into the executive. Because when you're determining policy, you need people who wear the shoes to be a part of the process. You don't need others to try to pretend that they know for others. And so I'm an advocate in that regard of inclusion, inclusionary governance. Some people call it power sharing, from the standpoint of ensuring that all of the ethnic groups are at the table, so that as we craft our policies and our programs, they can be responsive to the needs of the people, in Guyana who are diverse.
No, we currently have, and we've had diversity within the executive, ethnic diversity within the executive. What we haven't had is ethnically defined diversity in terms of constituency within the. So I'm getting it. If you're proposing that you view ethnicities as constituencies within that sort of power sharing model, and how is it that you propose that we do that?
Well, we have had ethnic diversity in terms of bodies, but the people who are there have not come to the table accepting the problem that exists and accepting that their role is in fact a representative role of a particular ethnic group, even as they seek to represent the broader issues of Guyana at large. And I think that is where the problem is. To a very large extent, where we have ethnic presence, it is not necessarily representative from an ethnic perspective. And even the people who are there don't present themselves as representatives of a particular ethnic group. We need people who are clearly conscious, and committed to representing an ethnic group in the context of a diverse society that constitutes a single nation state.
Can I just jump in there, Ruel? Because
Yeah.
the formula that you're suggesting is very similar to what's in Suriname, where you have parties which are explicitly and intentionally ethnically based, and there is no confusion as to what they're representing. That means a constitutional change to some
Oh,
extent.
certainly. Now, in some regards, the Suriname experience is one that we could learn from. I don't think that they necessarily have the exact prototype, but certainly they have accepted the problem. They have ethnic parties, they've accepted the parties as ethnic parties, and the way they've constructed the process for the realization of the government takes into consideration that acceptance and that representation.
A quick follow-on: should the parties themselves have that representation? So, for example, should the PNC have an Indian, Amerindian caucus, which meets and presents those notions, their priorities to the party?
Let me say a proposition I actually made to the party when Mr. Hoyt was the leader. I called it ethnic politics in the party. And my position was anyone is free to join the party from any ethnic group, though the parties may be dominated by a particular ethnic group. Anyone is free to join. My position was that when they join, they should join consciously coming to represent the interests of the group from this group. And so the party, in a sense, would be a collective where different people speak to different interests. And based on what they bring to the table, then the collective seeks to come up with programs and policies to address the specific interests, even as they collectively address national interests. In that regard, yes, it is possible that they could be a caucus, but it isn't absolutely necessary. They could be a part of the collective, bringing their view from an ethnic perspective.
Michaela?
Yeah.
Yes, thanks. We're coming up to half hour already. Yeah, Guyana Beyond 2030, but as I said, we're in 2025, cognizant that it's an election year, cognizant that Mr. Alexander described much of his involvement in terms of politics. I just wanted to go straight into our election system. And given that, just this past week, I submitted my income tax form using an app that the GRA has rolled out. It's called PADNA. And so we are seeing that many institutions, they're innovating technologically, the banks, airport departures, and as I said, GRA. Can we fix our electoral system? What changes, constitutional changes are required for a modern electoral system, Mr. Alexander?
There are two aspects to that. Our electoral system, first of all, has to be responsive to what I just spoke about, the plural society and providing the mechanisms for representation. In that regard, I am an advocate, also strong advocate, of vertical decentralization. Because to a very large extent, Guyanese live in enclaves, ethnic enclaves. I believe we should really use the concept of subsidiarity, allow those enclaves to be able to do all that is doable in those enclaves for themselves, rather than having central government impose it. So our electoral system has to be responsive in the sense that our electoral system cannot be one which really shows up the rule of the majority. It has to provide, in some regards, for constituencies, but it also has to provide for a conclusion that brings together in a manner in which Suriname brings together the various forces for the purpose of rulership, for the purpose of creating an executive, which must be united around a program. It must not merely be a collective of bodies. It must be a collective of ideas that are agreed to.
Yeah.
That's the electoral system from the standpoint of what it should be intended to do. But we also have a lot of work to do in terms of the technical, procedural, and administrative aspects of our electoral system. Our electoral system has suffered from the levels of distrust and all the maladies that have affected our society. Our electoral system has become a microcosm of those maladies. And at the base of it is a question of trust on one hand, and you made a point earlier about technology, the use of technology, because I think that one of the problems we have is with the trust issue, the human factor becomes a critical factor in our elections. And we can do much better if we were to reduce the impact of the human factor by the use of technology.
Ruel?
Yeah. I would have some, I guess, disagreements, but this is more in the view thing. Well, I would say that coming out of the last elections, the best technology would not mitigate malfeasance on the part of any player. I think if somebody decides that they will simply not go along with the system, they will not go along with it. I think the trust issue is based on history and quite frankly bad actors. But that said, I mean, in a practical sense, we have maximum of probably about we're in April now, about 8 months, less, 7 months for the constitutional deadline for elections. If we honor the constitutional deadline, a maximum of 3 months after August 2nd, if I'm correct. Do you have a pathway to both put in place the safeguards that you suggested and still adhere to the constitutional deadline for elections, for hosting elections? Is there as a pathway been put forward?
Let me first of all agree with you that we have disagreed on an issue.
Yeah.
Of course, there is a problem of malfeasance, and that is a fact as a consequence of the human factor. But I don't think that the nation as a collective has necessarily accepted all of the malfeasance, and that there's a tendency to be very narrow in terms of which malfeasance is being referred to.
Yeah, but
I feel that there has been insufficient evidence to support that there's been malfeasance in the actual casting of votes. And there is where I feel...
In the last elections? Sorry? In the last elections?
Last elections.
Okay.
In the last elections.
Yeah.
And there is where I feel that the casting of votes using the digital fingerprints for identification could be useful. The fact of the matter is, in the last elections, that unfortunate recount provided allegations that there were votes cast for people who were not present.
Yeah. I would say this.
Let me finish this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
GCOM was in possession of those accusations even during the recount.
Yeah.
2 of the exemplars were sent for verification. Verification was done, and that verification suggests that there was malfeasance in that regard. There were scores of other such accusations which have been corralled by the government in the person of the Minister of Justice, the Attorney General. When he corralled them, he said he was doing so he can prove by having the relevant investigations done at immigration that these were false accusations. Almost 2 years have passed. They've been corralled. He's definitely silent on this matter. And in the circumstance of the 2 reports which I have access to, and which suggested that of the allegations, 80% in each instance suggested that people overseas and or dead were voted for, though not themselves present, leads me to unequivocally conclude that there was malfeasance, not only in the way in which people tend to say today, but also in terms of the vote, casting of votes. And here is where I think technology can play a very important part. And let me say further, I think that the chances are that malfeasance in our elections are balancing acts, right? And if we didn't have initial malfeasance and distrust, there'd be no need for the balancing act, and the human factor would be quite different in the process.
Yeah. What I would say is this. I mean, not only was I a stakeholder in the last elections in terms of being part of a party, but after the elections, and I would say this as a stakeholder that ran in clear contest, without favor to either of both major parties. This one, and two, I spent several months after the elections as in an editorial position at Kaichur News, with no skin in the game on either side. We invited time and time again particularly the coalition, to bring us evidence of exactly what we suggested. Whenever they did, we tested it, and we found that there was no such evidence. In fact, there was contradiction. There were claims
So
that people who
evidence that I have just referred to, that you were in possession of, tested, and found it to be not above board?
Well, I don't know the evidence you refer to, but I'm saying that the evidence we got, which included, by the way, the lists of people who were allegedly overseas and voted, there are two things. One, the ones that we couldn't verify, we found no evidence corroborating the claim. But the ones that we did verify, we found evidence contrary to the claim. In fact, and this is evidence supposedly that came from official sources. In fact, one reporter who had assigned to that particular task saw two names that were given and immediately verified, because they were her family, that they were in country and in fact voted, when the claim was that they did not.
Gentlemen, yeah. I don't want us to use this occasion to litigate what happened progress there. But let's try and look forward. This is about beyond 2030. So let me ask the question on both sides.
Just suffice to say this, that the reports from immigration officers did not concur 100%. And therefore, there is nothing unusual if some persons were brought forward, because the report did say that it's only a percentage that were proven to be.
Okay. We're going to take that offline. But what I'd like to understand from you, Vincent, is how do we avoid these challenges going forward? What does our electoral system look like? You know, are we talking about biometric voting, etc.? In 30 seconds, tell us what the system, given your experience, should look like. And I'd like you, as a former active participant in this role, to give your opinion. And Michaela, you're an interested party also.
Well, let me say, I concur. I concur that in the long term, and for all the fundamental reasons that Vincent mentioned, is that we need to have the best technology available to mitigate the distrust, etc., in the system. I concur completely with them. Once it is put in place in a practicable time frame.
And Vincent, can that be done for biometrics for these elections?
If the elections are to be held at the time designated, at this time it is not easily doable. From the experts whom I have communicated with, they had said to me we should have started at least in January.
Okay, so they can be done.
So it's a difficulty with them being done.
Okay.
But there is a scenario in 1990. Huh?
1990.
1990. When there were problems and accusations, the parties got together and they agreed to give time for the fixing of the problem. I haven't heard the parties approach that issue in that manner.
Okay. So we need to use the best technologies, which may include biometrics going forward. And also we need, in your view, to have parties being explicitly, or caucuses within them being explicitly ethnic in terms of their orientation.
Certainly.
Michaela?
Let me say this way. In terms of the problem, we also need an approach to our voters list. We have a voters list that now is in the vicinity of 720,000, with a population that may be 800,000. And it has been my contention that we do not have the mechanisms to ensure that all of the dead persons are taken off the list. Forget the other issues, all of the dead persons. We do have a situation where I think there are tens of thousands between 2008 to now, where dead persons are on the list. We have to confront that challenge.
Okay. And I'm sure that'll be done. Michaela?
Yeah, no, exactly that. And, you know, for me, I'm sure Guyanese generally, it's our, you know, we would have wanted something concrete this year. So we understood the context Mr. Alexander shared in how things had to have been done before in order for it to happen in this election year. But, you know, as you said, the focus is on Guyana Beyond 2030. And it's a Guyana where we want as an electorate, as citizens, confidence in an electoral system rather than maintaining the status quo of elections over the years. So indeed, we would be, open to our leaders in Parliament making the necessary changes. But going back to what we started the conversation with, and words coming out of Mr. Alexander in about, new leadership, new culture, and having leaders who are objective, patriotic, tolerant, good governance, just some of the words you used. And why are we not? What is preventing this based on your own, your expertise and your years that you have served and have been in this particular field? What do our leaders, what do we need to do and be as Guyanese to have those attributes in our politicians and in our leaders to maintain that leadership, that new culture for Guyana beyond 2030. Beyond 2030, we're not thinking only 2030. We have to wait until then. We have to ensure that we ask for this kind of leadership as well. So I'm interested in hearing from you, what has prevented us from us finding, or, why are we not having these attributes that you outlined at the start of the program?
In any society, the family unit is a foundational and fundamental unit. And what happens in the family permeates all of our institutions eventually, the values called inculcated, etc. And so I think attention has got to be paid not only to the family unit, but to the product of the families. And in our country, where we have ethnic problems, in our country where we have problems with single-parent families, I think a greater role has to be played by the state in bringing up future generations, probably in the short to mid-term, and we can overcome the problem. And the state, in doing so, will have to provide for a curriculum which speaks to the truth about Guyana, the history of Guyana, the role of the various groups in Guyana. This curriculum also has to be a virtual example of what we want to build in terms of the Guyanese society. And so in the school, not only should we be involved in academics, we should be involved in all of the facets of societal activities in a manner that we will have shared values coming out of what happens in the education system. So for me, this exercise is more of a medium-term exercise. We have got to grow a new generation, not only from the standpoint of age, but from the standpoint of thinking.
Yeah.
We've got to grow a new generation. So education becomes very, very critical. And a lot of emphasis has got to be, you've got to be committed to change and to see that change in terms of the change of the Guyanese personality. And that has to be done, really should be done in the family. I think our families are in some senses dysfunctional in that regard because of their own biases or because of the absence of their own proper formation. And so the state has to take a tremendous responsibility. And I think both of you would, in some regards, understand what I'm speaking to, because I think it is that kind of endeavor that Burnham sought to undertake when he established President's College.
And with that, I want us to segue into your two other roles. You're a founder of the Burnham Foundation and also heavily involved in the pedagogy. Let's go to the issue of or the topic of Burnham. I mean, I don't want to litigate what Burnham's history, etc. But what's the relevance of what Burnham stood for beyond 2030? What are the values we could take forward, and also what are some of the challenges? Because he wasn't an entirely perfect human being. What are some of the mistakes you believe that we shouldn't repeat, which happened under Burnham?
First of all, I would say that Burnham had a very good vision.
Had a what?
Very, very good vision for the country. And not only am I saying that, but even as we go forward, as we've gone forward, quite a few of the things which have been embraced, though not identified necessarily with him, were a part of his vision. So he had a very good vision. I think that one of the major fault lines of Burnham was he did not overtly, and it's something I referred to earlier, but not in these terms, he did not overtly accept the ethnic problem. But he covertly sought to address that problem. And in so doing, found himself in problems of being accused of all sorts of things, some of which were not true, like being racial. I would put my head in the block that Burnham, I was not racial. But not having accepted overtly and having done things covertly. There was this accusation of him being anti-Indian, for example. As I said, I don't accept that that was indeed the case with Burnham. I think in some regards, Burnham was also impatient, and also not sufficiently tolerant, and some element of arrogance as well. And, one of the problems that we've been faced with in our politics is the contention that the end justify the means. And, only last night I was at UC Guyana's 100th birthday anniversary, and I made the point that if there was one thing that we should like UC Guyana for, was that he was a morality politician. And one of the problems we have in Guyana is we've accepted a definition of politics that is insidious, that is, in fact, it does not serve the purpose of human and national development. We've got to redefine politics as politics for development rather than politics for power.
So Burnham was not sufficiently moral, but utilitarian.
There may be some issues in morality.
Okay, interesting. Ruel, I'm sure you would love to jump in on the Burnham issue.
No, I fundamentally agree with regard to where the utilitarian aspect of the execution of Burnham's vision, in far too many instances, overtook the vision, and quite frankly, perverted it. So yeah, I'm in agreement on this thing. I guess the opportunity is now to say which aspects of the vision that Vincent seeks to perpetuate does he think would be relevant 2030 and beyond. If we want to sort of keep on theme.
Mm-hmm. I think the question of building an economy that is responsive to the needs of the ordinary people is still a critical question. I feel that Burnham was correct in the use of the cooperatives. I'm not sure all of his operatives were correct in the way they used it, but I think he was correct in the use of the cooperatives, and I see a role for cooperatives even today in terms of allowing our wealth to be shared uh, across the board rather than to be shared at the top of the society. And if we encourage cooperatives in the manner in which they were intended to be, which allowed for human resources to cooperate, to bring together their other resources and to become involved in entrepreneurial and other activities, thus providing for more of our wealth being distributed to the people at large. That's still a very, very critical aspect of where we are faulting and where Burnham, in fact, made good decisions. Even in terms of housing, I mean, the PPP has done a lot about making lands available. Lots of people who have the means have built houses, but the ordinary man still does not have access the way in which Burnham allowed them access in his housing policy. The conditions about the acquisition materials, the way cooperatives operated, people were allowed time to go and build their houses. Access, small man's access.
Small man becoming the real man.
We call it that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to turn to Epadagy. Again, sometimes I'm not really sure what Epadagy is about. Is it a sort of, racial front? Is it an ethnic organization? What are your senses, Michaela?
Well, Epadagy, I had the good fortune of interacting a few times, learning about some of its work and outreach. But of course, and Mr. Alexander is best to tell us what its current role is in 2025 as we think about Guyana Beyond 2030. But beyond that, so we've got to hear briefly from Mr. Alexander about the role of Epadagy now. There was a question, Kojo, that I saw. I think it was meant for all four of us. Perhaps you'll have to see that back because we're down to our last 8 minutes on the show. So let's hear from Mr. Alexander firstly about Epadagy's impact and role in 2025 and in the years to come.
Epadagy was responsive to United Nations Declaration of Decades of People of African Descent. In that declaration, United Nations made it clear, starting with the Durban Conference, that there were institutional and legal arrangements that still remained in countries that were disadvantageous to the people of African descent, and that the people of African descent would not have had an equal opportunity over the decades coming out of slavery and because of the regimes that persisted after. And so essentially what the decade is about, how do we redress and address institutional and legal regimes that are disadvantageous to people of African descent, and how in addition to addressing that, equitable programs are put in place. So as we address those things, that the equitable programs will allow them to have some concept of equalization in the country. And so that is what Epadagy is really about. There are a lot of other things that are peripheral, like doing projects and so forth. Of course, education, empowerment of the people is also a very critical part. Ensuring African organizations are well organized and in fact are focused. But we were preparing for an interaction with government as an advocacy group. We saw it as a major part of our work, preparing for government as an advocacy group. And we approached the president in that regard after doing work for about a year and a half preparing. And unfortunately, all sorts of red herrings and all sorts of things have been thrown at us. And we've never had the opportunity to interact with government for the purpose of advocating against the background of what the decade was intended for.
I want to ask something which a couple of people have asked me, Vincent. How about the other major ethnic groups? Is there a version of Epadagy which we should have in Guyana so as to replicate or create what you've talked about earlier on, that each of the ethnic groups should have they come to the table with their own issues?
In what I talked about earlier, in our governance, yes, each of the ethnic groups should come to the table with their own issues. That's clearly what we need without a decade. But the decade has to do with history. I think when you look at the society, I think it was concluded internationally that the most disadvantaged people, because of colonization, etc., were the indigenous people. And so there were 2 decades for them. I think on that scale or ladder of the disadvantage, that the people of African descent are next.
Okay.
And so here we are for their decade. This does not preclude at some point specific attention being given to other groups.
Right.
But if we were to have the kind of governance system which I advocate for, that system itself will do the job that has to be done and not have the international community tell us that job has to be done.
Yeah.
We're hitting the last 5 minutes, and I want to give it to Ruel and Michaela.
What I would say is that without getting into the details of engagement versus non-engagement, I think the current government, has been serious when it comes to the large issue of the reparations, for example, and advocating for that, and paying serious attention to the issues that are raised. I think we're going into the second decade. I think it's the second UN decade being initiated currently.
Has been.
So, and I will say this: I am heading to two conferences in the next 2 weeks. One in the UK, the reparations issue, and one in the US. UN. So the commitment is there. I've worked with Coffee Tree 250 before, and I'm prepared to work again with them, both in my individual capacity as well as if the government decides to designate that sort of interaction. So I will say that.
The difficulty I have is that the government has demonstrated a commitment to reparations, but those are external reparations. I have not seen a commitment to internal reparations, internal repair, to deal with the Padaji the way they dealt with the Padaji. Certainly does not demonstrate a commitment, among other things. But that, to me, is the clearest indication that the government has not committed itself. Because if you deal with the people of African descent, you can't run around creating your own organizations. Even if you do that, you have to speak to the collective.
The argument may be made by government that there may be a de facto overt weighting of Ipadaji in a politically partisan manner. And I think that's the case that it is made.
I think that's again something that we could litigate until the cows come home or around that. Michaela, why don't you
All right, so with 3 minutes remaining, Mr. Alexander, and none of the questions, regrettably, that came in during the conversation, but hopefully we'll be able to get them answered at some stage. Yeah. So we thank you for your time today and for the interaction that we've had. At this stage in your life, what and all that you have been part of, continue to be part of, what do you find the most hope in for Guyana?
The most hope probably is for the wealth we have. So that we have now the means to make a difference in the lives of people. Yeah. We have those means. It is how we use those means that's the problem. So there is hope insofar as we do not have to any longer search for the means. But there are serious problems about how we deploy what we have.
Yeah. Ruel, any final?
Yeah. My final. I might have shared the sentiment. I think Vincent might better serve in the leadership of the PNC than where he currently is. I have no problem endorsing that.
Very quickly, someone is asking, how can Ghana leverage its emerging oil economy to promote substantial national development? 10 seconds.
So we have to find a way in which, as we benefit from oil, to expand the economy beyond oil. Because this beyond 2030 we're talking about is not about oil. It's about an economy that has been robustly constructed so that when we stop getting the oil, we still have a sound economy that will continue to afford us the quality of life we're looking for and the future.
Vincent, this has been fascinating. Apart from the use of technology to ensure that as we go past 2030, we have a credible and a trust-defying system. Your advocacy of a new man and making the small man, as Burnham talked about, the real man, is something I think we need to probably examine in more detail going forward. But I'm particularly interested in the issue you raised around specific and intentional ethnic representation being embedded in our constitution, but also in our body politic, because that will be a change, and for many people it may be a very positive change. And I want to thank both Ruel, who was quite subdued this evening, and Michaela for being really inspiring co-hosts. And as we go forward, I'm sure we'll probably like to have you back. But thanks again, and thanks to the GBJ platform and to the audience out there. And please keep sending your questions in. Harold, it's noted, and there will be a post-show discussion on the various platforms. So please continue to populate those platforms. Thanks again, everyone, and see you again first Sunday, every Sunday of every month. Nation building, Guyana Beyond 2030. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.